I'm Lori Glickman. I'm the Associate Director at the National Transit Institute, and I just wanted to say hello and welcome. Today's session is NTD data feedback session for tribal and small system reporters. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank you all for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. We are pleased to have Tom Coleman and Michael Kay as our presenters today. Excuse me. Tom Coleman is the Federal Transit Administration's National Transit Database Program Manager based in Washington, D.C. He has over 10 years of experience working for multiple federal agencies and DC's Department of Transportation before joining FTA. One of his focus areas and the focus of today's webinar is to improve the value and usefulness of NTD data to the transit community. Michael Kay is a transportation planner with the US DOT Volpe Center based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Michael joined the Volpe Center in 2007 and supports various offices in the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Railroad Administration, in addition to FTA. Michael has previously facilitated FTA focus groups at the annual TAM, Transit Asset Management, Multimodal Roundtable, and the Transportation Research Board annual meeting. During today's presentation, you can ask a question at any time by typing it in the Q&A box. Sorry. If you don't see the Q&A box, it should appear on your Zoom sort of menu toolbar that is likely at the bottom of your screen. If you still don't see the Q&A option, you might hit ... and it would be under the More area. We ask you to use the Q&A box specifically for questions so that it doesn't get lost if the chat box is busy scrolling, and then there's a dedicated place to put your questions so that they can be answered. Again, you can also use the chat box to chat with me or the presenters or your fellow attendees. I think that's it for the housekeeping. I will be putting some information for you in the chat box, so keep an eye out for that. And without any further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Tom and Michael.
Thank you, Lori. And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As Lori indicated, my name is Tom Coleman, and I'm FTA's National Transit Database Program Manager. I am joined today by Michael Kay, and we'll be switching off slides and presenting to you. Next slide. First, I'd like to say welcome again and thank you for joining. Today's webinar's objectives are to gather stakeholder feedback on existing uses of NTD data from people such as yourselves, identifying user needs for future NTD data products. And our intended audiences are larger transit operators, full reporters, small transit operators, small urban and tribal reporters. This is today's group that is largely comprised of you and other attendees. And last, a focused webinar on subrecipients, rural reporters, states, and group plan sponsors. We have a good turnout today. More than 90 of you signed up, and it looks like we have about 50 today in attendance, and in total from about 40 states. So we have really good nationwide representation. Last, today's webinar assumes some prior knowledge of NTD data, and if you need further resources, NTI has a website for that we'll be sharing in a few slides. Next slide. Now the legalese disclaimer. The contents of this document do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. This document is intended only to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under law or agency policies. Grantees and subgrantees should refer to FTA statutes and regulations for applicable National Transit Database requirements. This session is being recorded. Feedback is not anonymous. And if you want to provide private feedback, please reach out to us via email at ntdfeedback@dot.gov. This email will remain open for the next week to receive and integrate your comments among those received at today's webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Michael for some more information on how we'll be running today's webinar.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon or good morning to you all. I just wanted to go over the structure of today's feedback session. We're going to try to orchestrate a bit of a virtual focus group, if you will, virtual listening session. Obviously, under different circumstances, I can envision us all in a large ballroom, engaging directly with one another. But given the circumstances, we appreciate you joining us virtually, and we'll make the best of it. So I wanted to note 3 different mechanisms by which we will solicit your direct feedback in particular. One is polling, and I'll have a poll up for you in just a moment. And we'll have various polls throughout. We also have some flexible polls in case we have any input, say through the chat box or Q&A box that we want to take some, get some further iteration or feedback upon. I alluded to the 2 other mechanisms through which you can provide your input. One is that chat box, and there's also the Q&A box as well. You'll find that along a tab on your screen. It might be at the top, might be at the bottom, but you'll see the options there, and I see some comments already coming in. We want to ask that you use the chat box for more general feedback and responses to some of the questions that we'll be asking of you audibly. The Q&A box is really more for specific questions or insights for the benefit of FTA. And we have a couple of colleagues of mine participating with us. Rahi Patel and Noah Augustine will help answer some of the Q&As for you individually. And certainly if any follow-up is needed, we'll be happy to follow up with you thereafter. This is going to be a text and polling input only listening session. So do recommend that you take use of each of those functions, and we'll make sure to pause for hopefully a sufficient amount of time at various points to give you enough time to give some critical thought to some of your inputs, but really do encourage you all to be actively engaged so that we can have a good dialogue here. So with that, I will pull up the first couple of our poll questions. This one pretty straightforward. Just want to inquire about your affiliation, government agency, private operator, whether you're with a private sector company or trade group or other. And if you are with a different entity, if you don't mind populating into the chat box with whom you're affiliated, or even just the category that you would articulate for yourself, that would be beneficial for us. I see the responses coming in. Higher education, good to see that, thank you. I see the responses coming in. I'll wait just another 5 seconds. And I will go ahead and end that poll. We'll go ahead and we'll share the results of some polls. And for some others we may not, but just in the spirit of transparency, the predominance of you are with government agencies, but we do have a few from academia and a couple from the private sector as well. Let me pull up one more poll for the moment. Wondering about your previous participation in National Transit Database or NTD related webinars, whether today is your first one, and reflecting back in the past year, if you've participated in one or fewer in the past year, or more than one in the past year. So we'll give about 10 seconds for that. In a couple more seconds, and I will close that out. And we have quite a broad diversity of participants. A little over a third of you are joining us for the first time, and welcome. And for over 60%, you've attended webinars, not only in the past, but at least, in most cases, at least one in the past year. So we'll be pulling these up throughout. But with that, let me just briefly go over today's agenda. We have 4 main discussion topics today, and we have 90 minutes to get through them. You'll notice we don't have timestamps associated with each. We have some kind of internal record keeping for ourselves so that we can make sure to get through everything. But we do want this dialogue and discussion to evolve naturally. So if we need some more time on a particular subject, we'll be happy to take it. But first, we'll be sharing with you what we know about our known users and specifically known uses of NTD data. And as an extension of that, we'll review some of the published data products, and Tom will be going through some of those. Then we'll switch to ascertaining a little more from you about both your existing needs and anticipated future needs with regard to NTD data. And we have some probing questions and some poll questions to assist with that. And we'll leave some time at the end for general discussion and Q&A. And with that, we're going to get right into our first section, and I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Thank you, Michael. Now we'd like to dive in, and hopefully everyone here has found the polling easy. And apologies if the polling is overwhelming, you don't have to answer them, but they're really effective in kind of like measuring your feedback. And the whole point of this is to get some good collaboration and dynamic feedback. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is known users and uses of NTD data. The next section will summarize who we know use NTD data, particularly in government and some of the other users. And then at the end, we'll move towards kind of getting some new ideas on where we might be going. Next slide. Actually, I think the slide is this the right slide?
Sorry, Tom, I advanced us, I think, one further. Oh,
oh no, yeah, you're good. Yeah,
okay.
Perfect. Thank you. And the NTD was created by Congress in 1974. The database houses financial, operating, and asset condition data of America's transit systems. It is maintained by the Federal Transit Administration. It includes a website for providing access to data products for the public. We'll be discussing a sample of these products, their uses, and future alterations to these products. But this session is really about you and listening to what your uses currently are and what they could be in the future. Next slide. Okay, so to understand data uses, we need to know really who the users are, and then we can get into kind of how they're using them. In addition to yourselves, there are 4 general groups that we know of. First are government agencies. Second are private operators. Third are private sector companies or trade groups. And fourth are academic. And with government agencies, I'm including tribes because I think that's a core user and attendee today. So thank you for joining. Next slide. And before we jump into like giving you some demos of some of the uses and how the NTD data is being used, here's some broad examples of how we at FTA use NTD data. The FTA uses it first and foremost for apportionment. And while we won't be getting too far into that today because it's largely set by Congress, that is one core use of NTD data is for apportionment. Other FTA uses of NTD data are tracking service consumed data, such as trips or rides, service supplied data, such as vehicle revenue miles or VRM, monitoring safety data, collecting transit asset management data, and reviewing financial data. Next slide. Some other uses of NTD data, we're also aware of those. We know that users include transit industry, for other uses such as responding to media inquiries, peer benchmarking, and additional ones we'd like to explore today. Next slide. Now let's get into some more details and actually show you some screenshots and some of the uses that we're talking about with some specific examples. So step 1 is really, where do I even find NTD data? So here on your screen, you'll see at the bottom the website or URL where you can find most NTD data products. This is our primary data product repository. This website has a toggleable filter that allows you to find different types or categories of NTD data files or data products. And there are too many categories to cover all of them today, but we're going to start with data tables, otherwise known as annual data table Excel files. And we're going to look at 2019 data. That's the most recent published NTD data, although we are releasing 2020 data in the next month or so. Next slide. There are 14 data tables shown here. So again, the first category is annual data table, and we have 13 of those different ones. Here I've circled the second one because the top file is actually a combined file of all the other 13. So vehicles, which I'd like to go over, is one of those 13 annual data table files. Let's do a deep dive with like a use case of how you might use that 2019 vehicles data table file. And the question I'd like to explore is, how many vehicles does an agency have, or kind of even the nation have? And you can find that with this file. Next slide. All right, so let's find this together. So here's actually, when you open the file, once you get it from that website, you can see we've sorted by the top agencies. In part, we sort by the size of the agency because agencies generally want to know about peers, and based on fleet size for the vehicles annual data table file, that makes the most sense for the use that we know of. And again, that use is really getting basic descriptive statistics about vehicle numbers across the country's transit fleets. So the top one is actually MTA New York City Transit. New York is a bit different than other agencies, so I'd like to turn to number 2 listed here, which is Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. They have vehicles operating at maximum service, or VOMs, of 3,469 vehicles. That's underlined in red. That means that LA Metro has almost 3,500 transit vehicles operating at its peak fleet service. And of those, 1,962 are buses, 383 are articulated buses, and the further types aren't even shown here. There's a whole bunch of them in different columns. I could only show you these for the size of the screen. And you can do the same thing with other agencies like WMATA here in Washington, D.C., CTA in Chicago, SEPTA in Philadelphia. And so the use case here that I wanted to highlight is you can look up peers. And while I'm just showing the top agencies here, even if you're a small transit operator, this file can help you locate kind of peers in terms of fleet size and get some answers about different vehicle types that compose that fleet. Next slide. Another use case of this file, there are several tabs in it, or I guess Microsoft Excel tabs. So at the bottom, this tab is Summary Tables Age Distribution. And you may have heard of the term business intelligence, or BI. This is a visualization, and this file provides a use case where you can kind of get the full nationwide distribution of the entire transit fleet by the age of the vehicle. And so this Excel file in this particular tab is not tabular like the last one. It is providing the distribution, which shows actually there's a good, I guess, distribution of ages amongst the transit agencies. So the average age is around 7 or 8 years old for a transit agency fleet vehicle. And you can see though it ranges from like 0 years brand new to 60 or more. Next slide. Next, there's 13 annual data tables. So let's jump to another. We just went through vehicles. Let's jump to another one. So another one with a great use case that we use often is the 2019 metrics annual data table file. Here it's circled. Next slide. The metrics annual data table file has a number of interesting points. A major one is what's called fare box recovery. So here the columns I've underlined in red are fare revenues per unlinked passenger trip, cost per passenger, and then fare revenues per operating expense, or recovery ratio. And that last column is fare box recovery. So for instance, New York City Transit has one of the highest, I guess, fare box recoveries for its HR mode, or heavy rail mode. And so that is about 0.7 or 70%. So for every passenger, they recover about 70 cents on the dollar. And that is higher than, for instance, demand response, that's only 2% or 0.02. And that is because heavy rail obviously takes a lot more passengers per trip. It only requires one driver, and a lot of the expenses are capital rather than operating expenses. So there's a lot of interesting kind of details, but it even splits up within agency differences and highlights how to see kind of like how much they recover per passenger carried. Next slide. Another annual data table file is the funding sources annual data table. So let's do a deep dive into that one. Here you can see the nationwide snapshot of capital expenses as fractional shares. So a common question we get asked is, what are the shares of local, state, and federal funding for both capital and operating? So this provides the pie chart of capital expenses. And you can see how much, again, each of those shares. So here it's 31% for federal, 23% for state, and 21% for local. I find this very interesting as a use case because we often, again, get asked those questions, and it's a visual rather than some table where you have to hunt and find and then, combine and do some math. Here it's all in one pie chart with the breakout for the country as a total. And also at the very bottom, you can see a tabular format where it lists various totals of different amounts. Next slide. I believe this is back with you, Michael.
Indeed, if I can figure out how to get my camera on and my mute dealt with. Yes, thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate that. So we do have a poll coming up. So we've talked about the funding sources data table, the metrics data table, and the vehicles data table, and we wanted to inquire about your level of awareness and involvement prior to today's focus group regarding these products. Let me take a moment just to orient you to the answer choices. We're seeking a very specific sort of feedback here. So the options range from being totally unfamiliar to being not only familiar with, but actually having used them previously. And some of the answers in between note that you maybe haven't utilized some of them, however you may or may not be familiar. So let me stop talking for a full minute, and please do take the time to read the choices and make sure we get your alignment correctly. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that one out. And we have a wide range here. Several of you, nearly half, are not familiar with these data products, and we welcome and invite you and thank you for being willing to experiment here and learn about them a little bit today and provide some feedback. And for another half of you, you have not necessarily used the data products or have used some, and in some cases are familiar with the rest, and in some cases aren't. So thanks again for responding and for joining us. We'll come back to this very same poll question. We'll relaunch it once we go through the next set of data tables. And for that, actually, Tom, I'll turn over to you in just a minute, but I do want to also mention, if you have utilized these data products before, or maybe you haven't, but are familiar with them, we certainly would welcome through the chat box you indicating how you've utilized these products, especially if those uses differ from the examples that Tom has provided already. So just keep that in mind, certainly really throughout the duration of the focus group. We certainly welcome your input, particularly on ways that you are using the information other than the examples that we're presenting for you. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it back over to Tom.
Thank you, Michael. And just reiterating what you said, I particularly am interested in even those folks who have never used or were unaware about the data products. And obviously the polls may not get your input fully, so we really welcome your chats. This is actually a small group. So if you want to chat, if anything looks interesting or something I'm showing you resonates that might be useful, please feel free to chat that. Also, if some idea pops into your head of like a use that you think would be useful for you, I'd love to know. So all right, now back onto our show. So I've covered the data category of annual data tables. Now I wanted to touch upon a different format of NTD data product, the non-Excel annual data products. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the National Transit Summaries and Trends, or NTST, as we call it. It is a PDF file. It is one of our annual data publications, and the goal of the NTST is to present and summarize transit data in an easy-to-read format and provide an overview of public transit in the United States. It uses a lot of visualizations and exhibits, but also pairs it with narrative text to interpret it. And it's just a PDF file. Next slide. So here's an example exhibit. It might look similar to some of the other charts from the Excel files. I would say one key difference is that the NTST has multi-year comparisons for a lot of its exhibits, and that is shown here. So this is an exhibit from the NTST. It shows from 2010 to 2019 how rail trips have risen, for instance, from 4.6 billion trips to 4.94 billion trips, and bus trips actually dropped from 5.3 billion to 4.8 billion. The hot question everyone's going to probably be asking is, with COVID, where are we today? Well, we'll be releasing a new version of this in about a month, maybe even less. And we're working on it right now. But even for future versions, we'd be able to incorporate your feedback potentially. But I guess the goal of the NTSD, again, is to provide a mix of narrative text that interpret and also some exhibits that might present stories not otherwise told in the other data products, like a single year Excel file, like the data tables. Next slide. And in addition to the NTST, there's a second non-Excel data product I wanted to highlight with a good use case. This is the annual data publications guide. And this is a separate PDF document that the NTD team produces each year. It describes how the NTD data tables and other documents or Excel files relate to one another from prior annual releases. It provides a mix of sort of reconciliation and other comparisons between files. So if you take one file and you try to match up totals, it can help you do that. And it uses NTD reporter type, file names, and really like aggregate totals. So where do file totals tie out, meaning agree or align, and where do they not? Next slide. So to provide an example of that, here's a screenshot from the NTD data publications guide showing how you'd reconcile data. The first row is from the 2019 revenue sources database file. That is another one of our many annual products. And it shows, for instance, that there were 7.648 billion in total capital source expenses. And the second row or data point that it's trying to reconcile against is the time series 1.3 funding sources data table. And it actually has a few different ones it's reconciling against. And for all those products, the TS 1.3, the 2019 funding sources data table, and the NTS and the profiles themselves, they all have this total of 7.644 billion. So you can, if you look at 7.648 billion and 7.644 billion, you'd say, well, why is the top row larger by about 4 million? I mean, that's close, but that seems wrong somehow. There's a discrepancy. Well, that's because of the file presentation and the scopes. So the NTD does not include entities such as intercity bus subrecipient funding data in some of its data products. And intercity bus subrecipients in some sense aren't operating true transit service, but they do receive FTA funding. So for instance, they wouldn't be reporting ridership or vehicle revenue miles. And so to present kind of a uniform picture, the second row data products exclude them, and hence that's in the last column, while in the top row in our database files, it's supposed to represent sort of an unfiltered look at certain data points. And so that's why database files may oftentimes be even larger than some of the ones where certain reporters that report limited data are excluded, like intercity bus subrecipients. And so you can use this PDF in order to reconcile across data products, and the link to that guide is there. Next slide.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to pull up that same poll question and relaunch it. Give me a moment. So specifically now about the non-Excel data products. We're curious to know if you are familiar with and or have utilized these in the past. While you're answering, I do want to suggest, if this is all brand new to you, we still would welcome in the chat box any thoughts you may have about how you can foresee your agency utilizing these data products going forward, sort of getting a real-time check on what you're learning today and how you may implement some of these products in your day-to-day or in your agency's analysis. So certainly encourage that sort of input through the chat box, or if you have questions about any of the products, please do feel free to use the Q&A box. We'll leave that open for about 5 more seconds, actually 10 more seconds. And I'll go ahead and close that out. And interestingly enough, Although a similar number of you are unfamiliar with the data products, those of you who do use these data products are actually seemingly more aware of the other data products than we had when we were polling you originally. So this is very useful feedback for us. And I did want to just make sure to keep an eye on the chat box. Appreciate Jacksonville Transit for getting us going here, noting that they can see the potential benefit of using some of this data in order to make comparisons of their own performance, as well as our overall operations. Seeing some other inputs come in. Let me just take a quick stock here. Is there any database available for rural community roads? So we can get into that going forward. And want to note Mark's comment that most of this data would be used to gauge their own system. It'd be helpful to have a drill down system, much like ELS does with its labor data. So we can get into that a little bit further as well, and different opportunities to drill down to analyses across various agencies. So please do, that's great. Appreciate a few of you getting us going here, and encourage all that type of input, and we'll come back to it soon enough. Even if we've already proceeded past a particular topic, please do utilize that chat box, and we'll make sure to come back to the subject later on. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom to talk about the monthly data files. Excuse me. There we go, Tom.
Thank you, Michael. That's some really great engagement, so really appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Hopefully, also this last category of data product I'm about to show you will get everyone pretty engaged, because we'll be discussing some potential changes to it. So, the last data category I'd like to discuss are our monthly data files. Here you can see there are two different files that we publish on that website I mentioned at the beginning. And there's actually the monthly raw data release and the monthly module adjusted data release. The difference is in the words raw and adjusted. And I just want to clarify why there are two and which one you should use. So in 99% of cases, I recommend using the adjusted data release file. The difference is that each month, a small number of reporters have not reported their monthly data. And the raw data release file contains these gaps which are unfilled in. The adjusted data release contains estimates for those entities that have not reported in their most recent monthly data files, so it's more complete. So especially if your use cases are around seeing the total nation as a snapshot, the adjusted file is the right place to go. And so, yeah, I would always recommend going to the monthly adjusted data release file. Next slide. The purpose and goal of this file is to provide more current data than our annual data collection. We constantly get asked, when is your new annual data coming out? It comes out in the fall of each year. And so again, we're still working on it to publish our 2020 data release. But the monthly data actually is released each month. And it only has a small amount of data, but it is very important data. The main use for this data is to provide really a current kind of snapshot of the nationwide transit systems. How many riders are there? How much has ridership decreased across the country and during COVID? So even though we haven't released our annual products that cover the COVID period, the monthly data files have been released each month and have some of that data. Other questions are, how much has service decreased across the country? So small transit operators, how much have they decreased in their kind of supply of transit service? So the monthly data set, a little more about it, it's released about 6 weeks after the period it covers. So right now, if you go on the website and you try to download that file, you'll see it covers through August 2021. And we released it around October 10th. And so the next one, which will cover all of September 2021, that will be released around November 10th. And so we release this each month. Next slide. Let's actually take a look at the file. So here you can see the format. It's an Excel file. Here I've highlighted the Tahoe Transportation District. The column IK contains this AUG21, that's August 2021. This is ridership, or UPT, meaning unlinked passenger trips. So in the month of August, just a couple months ago, Tahoe Transportation District carried 726 passengers or passenger trips. And that was for a specific mode and type of service. You can see all that in the file, but here I'll just tell you it was for their demand response mode. And so I wanted to highlight, so that's kind of like, it gives you a micro snapshot of each agency, who's reporting, and by mode, and even type of service. And at the very bottom of the file, there's actually subtotals. So I've highlighted it in red where you get the nationwide total. So this file provides an answer to the question, how many trips or riders were there across the country in August 2021? The answer is about 422 million. And that sounds like a lot, except that this is after COVID. And if you look back at the same time period of the prior year, so in the same file, it contains months going back, I think around 10 years, you can see that that 422 million is actually about 50% below August 2019, meaning the same month prior to COVID. So this is where you can get at, which months do we see some of that recovery? Where do we see kind of like ridership recovering in those areas of the country? You can get at that data using this monthly file with our most current data set. Next slide.
All right, thanks again, Tom. That is my cue, and we're gonna share that poll one more time. We have other polls, I promise, but we wanted to reflect back on the monthly data products, and curious to know if you are completely unfamiliar with those. Maybe you're not, maybe you've never used them, but you're familiar with some of them or all of them. And then the latter choices suggest that you have utilized some of them, and you may not be familiar or are familiar with the others. I'll again go on mute for about 30 seconds to give you a chance to absorb the answer choices and provide the one that's most applicable. Okay, so we're again getting a broad diversity of involvement, prior involvement with these data products, and it is certainly new to several of you, and that's great, and hope this is at least cluing you into some of the potential uses, and also giving you some thought about how you may be able to utilize them going forward for your agency in the future. Do have a couple other polls on this particular subject. So let me first end that poll and move on to this one. So these monthly data products are released every month, but on a 6-week lag. So there's a 6-week delay between when the data, when the month ends and the data is released. And curious to know if that currently meets your needs. And I will mention certainly that there are several efforts ongoing at FTA to reduce that lag, but just inquiring about whether that lag suits your needs currently. And I'll leave that open for another 10 seconds, but I can tell by the predominance of the responses coming in already that for the majority of you who utilize these products already, that lag actually does reasonably well suit your needs, with a couple of exceptions. And then for several others of you, you're not sure, and that may be because you're either unfamiliar with the products themselves, or you're not sure if a decreased lag would in fact benefit you. And maybe maybe experience and time will determine that. If you certainly want to propose other offer any thoughts as to how a diminished lag in the reporting would benefit your agency, again, please use the chat box. Or if you have any questions about the data products themselves or about the time frame for release, you can also use the Q&A box. One more poll here, and then we can spend a few minutes looking at the chat box and Q&A. So this one is inquiring if FTA were to, rather than collect all the data, if the FTA were to collect just 1 week's worth of data each month to estimate the remainder of the month's data, would that meet your needs? And certainly if it's not, or if you're not sure, again, please feel free to utilize the chat box to indicate how or why. And maybe just to respond to what I can imagine are some of the responses that may come in. For those of you who are indicating that it will not suit your needs, I think we will assume that one of the reasons why it wouldn't suit your needs is because that 1 week's worth of data may not be representative of the rest of the month. So let's take that as sort of the default assumption of the reasons why it wouldn't be meeting your needs. And I'm just stating that so that we can focus on some of the more unique inputs that may come in through the chat box, but feel free to propose anything there. Let me go ahead and end that poll. I will note that that is meeting your needs for a few of you. It's not meeting your needs for several more, and for still many others, not quite sure. So certainly we can discuss further and answer any questions you may have to help you better understand how that may or may not suit your needs. So I'm going to take a quick look over at the chat box here. Just give me a moment. Let's see here. So some questions are coming in, and I haven't had a chance to screen them, but I will take the opportunity to read a couple out. Michael wanted to just confirm that monthly reports only included full reporters. Wasn't sure if that was the case or not. Reduced reporters don't report monthly. Can you confirm that, Tom?
That's exactly right. Michael, if you could go back one slide. I like showing rather than telling.
Yeah, of course.
And I have my own Paul that's blocking me. Apologies. So here you can see actually we estimate those small, reduced, and rural reporter totals. So here is this is a ridership estimate. And so for instance, for the month of August, we have 5 million trips estimated for reduced reporters, 7.9 million rural trips for rural reporters, and so we roll all that into this row called subtotal with reduced and rural reporter estimates. So the full reporters, it's the vast majority. It's 409.2 million trips as opposed to 422. So 90% and more come from those full reporters. But you're right. For I guess so the answer is yes, that's correct. But we provide estimates at the aggregate level, and maybe we'll get into some follow up. But I am curious about the chat box. There were some other good questions unrelated. But does that answer that?
I think it shall, but Michael can confirm through follow up. Did want to note a couple of comments back on regarding the benefit of the data and being able to drill down. Someone had noted being able to use the data to make comparisons of not only their own performance, but their overall operations and some peer agencies as well. And it makes it easier to find data relevant to their site system. We'll actually have some poll questions a little bit later on about different scalability of the analysis and how you can do analysis just on your own agency. You can do analysis on your agency as compared to peer agencies, and you can do also broad analyses on nationwide on the entire country and the totality of agencies out there. Let me just reference real quick. Tom, we did have a question about the lag, and maybe that's an opportunity for you to explain efforts ongoing to reduce that going forward. Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. On the lag, I wanted to explain that. So right now we have a 6-week lag. There have been management and external questions to FTA often of, especially during the COVID period, of kind of what is the current picture of ridership across the country. And to get at the currentness, we have the monthly file, which has about a 6-week lag. We're considering options for how to shrink that while still making it operationally feasible. So if there are concerns, now I know that today's webinars are largely reduced in tribal reporters, which Michael brought up, I think Michael attendee, rightfully so, that most of you do not report the monthly module. Now I will say that we're looking at all aspects of the monthly report, and the lag is one of them. So how and where could we shrink it, for instance, of maybe just collecting a week of data and then still getting an early snapshot by using that to estimate a total month of data? That's one consideration. I don't know if that's possible or if you have thoughts on that. The other thing I wanted to bring up is we're looking at all agencies right now that submit annual, including reduced and tribal. Potentially, it could be that we start getting a more accurate picture of nationwide transit ridership and potentially vehicle revenue miles from small system or tribal reporters, even if it's just like sampling or something. We're looking at all aspects to try to get at an accurate, early, full representational picture of nationwide transit with this monthly data file, or potentially even splitting it up. I'm not sure yet, but we're looking at all options. So for this group in particular, I think and this, I don't know, it doesn't need to be a poll, but if you have reactions to the idea of having to fill out a monthly ridership or a monthly early kind of weekly estimate report for us, and you've never done that, that would be really helpful. So we're looking at just getting at the problem of getting as early as possible while all operationally feasible, full look at transit across the country in terms of ridership, meaning a demand kind of variable, but also a supply variable such as vehicle revenue miles.
Great. Thanks again, Tom. And I can confirm that participant Michael found your answer satisfactory. And thanks for indicating that, Michael. It's good to get that temperature check throughout. With that, Tom, we're going to go on and just provide a bit of a summary on what we've presented to you thus far, and then we'll pivot to some more polling, and we'll also pivot towards looking at some future needs as well. So, Tom, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, great. So I really just wanted to highlight that we went through 3 different categories of data products. They were the annual data tables, providing the examples of revenue vehicles, fare revenue in the metrics file, and then capital funding. A second type of NTD data product we went through were non-Excel files. They consisted of 2 PDF documents, the National Transit Summaries and Trends, where I showed a chart, and the NTD Data Products Guide, where I showed you a snapshot from that PDF where we reconcile some different totals that had a small difference and explained why. And then last, we just showed you the monthly data file, our most current kind of annual NTD data product that we produce more frequently than an annual one. Every month we put that out. And those are the 3 different types of data products presented today.
Great, thanks, Tom. And I did want to actually pull up one of our kind of flexible polls here, picking up on some of the comments that we're getting about monthly reporting and filling out forms. So just give me a second to make sure to pull up the right one. 19. So a poll is going to show up on the screen in a moment asking to what extent you agree or disagree with the following statement. And the statement is asking reduced reporters to start reporting monthly would be difficult. So I'm going to launch that poll. So if it would be difficult, then you'd be on the higher end of that spectrum. And if it would be easy, you'd be at the lower end of that spectrum. So be easy to fill out the form on the low end, difficult on the high end. Once you fill that out, if you have other reasons to support your response besides staff resources, understanding that's critical, among the critical ones, certainly feel free to pop that into the chat box. Reasons why it would be difficult or easy to fill out a monthly form. Again, 1 is easy, 7 is difficult. Leave that open for about 10 more seconds. 1 difficult, 7, I'm sorry, 1 is easy to fill out that form, 7 is difficult. I think most of you grasped that. And I'm going to close that in 3, 2, 1. Thank you for responding. And we got a broad-based response. Certainly, many of you ended up in the middle, if not towards the more difficult side. And we understand that, and we're looking for any and all feedback here. So certainly don't be shy. But we will move on to some additional poll questions here. We're now going to look back on the totality of data products that we've shared with you already today. And I want to pull up a similar poll to one used previously, but now we're taking into account all of the data products that we've presented for you today. And if you can assess on the total, whether you are familiar with and or have had prior involvement or usage with these products. I know, again, there are many choices and a lot of nuance. So once again, I'll go on mute for about 30 seconds to give you a chance to read all of the choices. And I appreciate that question from Allison, wondering how this is different from the question before. So this is, it just enables us to sort of aggregate the responses a little better. So we were previously just inquiring just about the monthly data products or just about the different tables. This is overall on the totality of products. If you were unfamiliar with all of them, then you would still suggest that you are unfamiliar with these data products. Hope that helps. I'll wait 10 more seconds. Okay, thank you for responding to that. The next one is, and this is a multiple answer. This gets at that scalability. For those of you who have utilized any of the aforementioned data product, at what scale have you utilized them? Have you done analysis just on a single agency, maybe your own agency, maybe another? Have you done analysis on a small set of agencies, maybe all those neighboring or all those that share certain characteristics in terms of ridership, in terms of population, fare box recovery, so forth? Or whether you've done analyses on the entire nationwide network of agencies. So, and you can obviously select multiple options here. And it's nice to see a really broad diversity of input here. Some of you, it appears, have actually done each of these types of analyses, which is great. And hopefully for those of you who haven't utilized them previously, it's giving you a window not only into what is available, but at what various levels you can perform these sets of analyses. I'll leave that open for 5 more seconds, and I'll go ahead and close it out. I've got a couple more real quick here. I'm actually going to skip that one and go to this one. So this is our second to last poll question in this section, and then we'll move on to looking at your existing and future needs. But this is inquiring about the complexity of NTD data products. For those of you who are familiar with them already, on the low end, you're finding them not complex or not robust enough, and on the high end, too complex or too robust to really understand and make them useful for you. And certainly, again, feel free to use the chat box to indicate sort of any nuance associated with your answer, in other words, the why. I'll give 5 more seconds on that one. And I'll close that out. All right, last one on this section. The question is the number of NTD data products the appropriate number? And if you think there are too few, that's on the low end, too many on the high end. If you're not sure, probably for the purposes of our feedback, you don't need to answer. That will be your non-answer will be indicative of that it's not necessarily applicable or that you don't have an opinion. Once again, is the number of NTD data products the right number? Are there too few data products? Too many? 4 would suggest it's the right number. All right, 5 more seconds. And I'll close that out. Great. All right, so now we're going to turn towards learning a little more about what your existing needs are and wondering if those needs that you have currently are or aren't being met already. So we're going to stick with the polls, but we're kind of changing gears a little bit. So just give me a second to find my place here. 11. Okay. Have you ever sought information from the NTD that wasn't available? And the maybe option is suggesting that you couldn't find what you were looking for, but you weren't sure whether or not it was there. So I'll give you 5 more seconds here. Great, thank you. Similar question coming up, but a little bit different. Have you ever sought information from the NTD that you had trouble accessing or exporting? So you knew it was there, but you had trouble obtaining it and or exporting it. Give you 5 more seconds. And we'll close that out. A couple more here. So if it's applicable, and this is another one of those multiple answer questions where you can submit, you can check multiple boxes. If any NTD data has confused you previously, what are some of the reasons? What are the reasons why the data has confused you? Maybe it's the formatting. Maybe the query that you performed yielded data or values that you couldn't interpret or didn't understand. And we're sure there are myriad other reasons why NTD data could have potentially confused you. And if you have other reasons, please, again, feel free to submit that in the chat box. All right, give you 5 more seconds there. And we'll go ahead and close that out. Thanks again. And with that, I'm going to close us out from these polls. Actually, one more here, sorry. Are you aware of how to contact FTA with suggestions or recommendations for NTD improvements? And certainly we hope to leave you at least with this much today. You'll have a couple of resources, including Tom's own personal email address at the end here, and other ways to follow up with us.
Yep.
All right, 5 more seconds on this one. And now we'll close that out. Great, thank you. So from here, I'm gonna skip this for the moment. I do want to make sure we move on to looking forward. You know, we've presented to you already on what the NTD has and what it does, but we were wanting to move more towards getting you to think about how you can envision the needs of your agency shifting already, maybe because of COVID or other reasons, and certainly moving forward. So what we're going to do first is Tom's going to present on a couple of emerging technologies that that we've seen and how they may be applied to the NTD moving forward, and then we'll open it up to broad discussion on how you can foresee your needs shifting and therefore how FTA can be of service going forward. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss a couple of these potential future data products.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why everyone's here is probably like, let's think about the future. So what are the possible data products and kind of their features and, again, use cases that we know about, we're kind of looking at. One is geospatial and the geospatial capabilities of the NTD. Right now, I think they're kind of like a few different components. There's some geospatial capabilities the NTD has. One is mapping of locations of NTD reporters. That's currently a website published by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. I'll show you that in a moment. There, in our data products, there are locations for reportable segments. That means that for high, for instance, bus rapid transit or other dedicated right-of-way segments, we have actually like the beginning and end points of those listed by address and that's in our reportable segments database file, as well as the length of those segments. Not necessarily the line or sort of geospatial plot, but at least the beginning and end point via address and then length. And last, we have in our safety and security data files, we have location coordinates with latitude and longitude for where those, for instance, major events occurred, such as a transit fatality. And those are kind of like some of the existing geospatial, but next slide, I'll show you what one might actually look like. I like maps. Great. And so this is the first one I mentioned. It's the location of NTD reporters. You'll see the URL at the bottom of the page. It's actually published by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, and it really takes the address of you and all NTD reporters and allows us to then, I guess, get an X and Y, meaning latitude and longitude coordinates, and then put those on a map. So that's already being done today, and I just want to highlight. So that is one example of, even just like where are our reporters located. This is sort of the map or geospatial use case of getting a visualization of that. That we're beginning to explore. For instance, things not on this map are, where are those reportable segments? Or, someone asked about, I think, rural roads. And right now the NTD primarily collects data that it needs to perform apportionment calculations. And so all of those fixed guideway lengths, like I mentioned with, high intensity bus or bus rapid transit, those we do collect via the start and end points. We don't necessarily collect the rural, I guess, roadway because that's under Federal Highway Administration. But, are we collecting as much as we should be for transit purposes? We're exploring that and really want your input on whether we're collecting the right amount and performing the right geospatial sort of enabling data collections, but also production. Next slide. The second one I want to talk about, and maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, is GTFS, or the General Transit Feed Specification. GTFS is an acronym, and that's what it stands for. The word specification refers to, it's a way of defining how to store transit data regarding stops, routes, schedules, and other kind of fixed or stationary points. It does some real-time tracking similar to AVL, but it really just sets the standards and specifications for getting all of the quote-unquote feeds, meaning URLs with data kind of like back and forth possibilities through scripting or algorithms that then can kind of, support apps or development and all that stuff. Currently, the GTFS is not necessarily the same thing as NTD. We use GTFS data on occasion, but we don't necessarily, integrate that fully into the NTD. We're exploring how to do that and how to make it happen. But why would we do it? So what are the possible use cases if we did explore and utilize GTFS data more? It could support additional mapping. It could support additional web development and applications. It could support our validation and estimation of vehicle revenue miles, vehicle revenue hours, and estimating vehicles operating at maximum service or BOMs. And currently, I think Bureau of Transportation Statistics, or BTS, has a number of connections to it. But from the NTD perspective, we're also looking at how we can use GTFS data and even work with you and help you locate and use other agencies and their GTFS feeds. And that's really real time and certain standardized data feeds using scripting rather than just like clicks and downloads. And with that, Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So I'm going to pull up a couple of polls in a second that actually anybody can respond to, even if you're not familiar with some of the NTD data products, because they're really getting at whether either of these two burgeoning elements, geospatial and or GTFS, may be useful to you. But before pulling up the polls, I just wanted to kind of do kind of a time check and just make one last pitch here. So we're nearing the end of, we're not fully done with our formal content, but we're nearing the end of the formal content that we wanted to present to you. And the last 20 minutes or so, or as much of it as we want to utilize, is really for you. So whether it's through the chat box or again through the Q&A, we're here for you to field input. Maybe there's some nuance associated with some of your answers to any of the prior polls, or some of the polls upcoming, or maybe you've withheld a question because it wasn't topical or you missed the moment. So I just want to kind of tee that up. We're here for you, and we're going to be staying on until 3:30 Eastern, or as close to that time as is needed. But start to give some thought to any questions you may have, or any additional insights that would be useful for FTA, specific on some of the subjects that we've already discussed today previously. So I'm going to pull up our next poll question. We're going to issue this twice. I'm going to issue this first specific to geospatial. So with regard to the geospatial elements in the map that Tom had displayed, wondering if that type of a resource would be useful to you, if the NTD data could be displayed geospatially. So I'll pause and give you a moment. And again, if you haven't, even if you're unfamiliar with everything we've presented to you already, I think you can certainly provide us some useful feedback on whether this type of resource may be useful to you going forward. And I'll go on mute for about 15 seconds. And it's nice to see, as I close that out, that, and I'll share this one as well, that most of you would find it useful among those of you who are sure whether or not it would be. But then I think it's important for us to recognize that for about half of you, you're not quite sure whether this type of resource would be useful. And I'll just encourage you, if you have any questions or thoughts on how, what is it that about a geospatial component of NTD data that would be useful or wouldn't be useful to you? Perhaps we can flesh out a little further beyond just knowing that you're not sure, but actually get down to some of the specifics as to why. If anyone cares to venture up a thought, we could potentially even pull up a couple of our flexible polls and assess everyone's opinion. But for the moment, I will stop sharing that poll. Actually, I'm going to share it again in a minute because I want to relaunch it. And for this time, though, we're going to ask specifically about GTFS, or the General Transit Specification Feed, wondering if there would be utility for that. Would you have a use for that type of resource? Give you about 10 more seconds. And I'll close that out, and I'm happy to share that. Similar responses. So again, for those of you who definitely are sure whether or not it would be useful or not, most of you believe it would be. And literally half of our respondents are not sure. So certainly we do want to get at the why you're not sure, or what would be helpful to make for you to have more of an opinion as to whether or not it would be useful. So if you have any questions along those lines, again, feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A. With that, I'll slide forward just a sec. So we are moving towards our open discussion, but we have a couple of probing questions, and I think I'm actually going to leave it on this slide. Let me just check ahead here. Yeah, I'm going to leave it on this slide. We're really moving towards our final discussion and Q&A section, and again, we have all the time needed between now and 3:30 Eastern within which to have that discussion. But I'll leave it on the slide because it has a couple of questions that maybe may spark some interest or discussion. So I'll read them out, and then I'll start to turn to my review of the chat box and Q&A and start reading some of those out. But thinking beyond geospatial and GTFS that Tom presented on, are there other formats of data that would be useful to you, useful at all? It doesn't need to be more useful, just useful at all to you. Are there specific data points that would be useful to you? Are there data products that don't yet exist but could be created that could be useful for you? So I think all these questions really, again, could be applicable to all of our audience today, regardless of whether you have any familiarity with NTD's data products previously, really wondering how FTA can be flexible and accommodating to your needs. So some of these questions are seeking to get at that. I'm going to go on mute for at least a full minute to give you some time to provide some other thoughts and give me a chance to kind of catch up with the chat box and Q&A. So be back with you in about a minute or so. Okay, so I am back with you now, and I appreciate some of the inputs we've had from the chat box recently. I wanted to just note Allison's useful comment about her utilization of the data previously. This is obviously related to one of our earlier topics, but she had an analyst assist her in downloading correctly the data, and then if she found utility in using it, and that's great. So we have notes about some people with us who are kind of new and just learning today, and that's great. Happy to have you. We can also make sure to link you to some of the other pre-recorded webinars with regard to NTD data. Recommendation from Sharon: be nice to have a it would be nice to have a standardized Excel spreadsheet that would capture all NTD required information fields for NTD small reporters. At this time, we gather our data on, and then it cuts off. But I think the point is well taken there. And lastly, from Mark, that they already have a GTS feed available on their AVL system. That's really great to know. So with that, we're going to move shortly to our final couple slides, and we have a couple last polls for you, but I still want to give one last opportunity for questions and comments. So I am once again going to go radio silent for at least 1 minute, and we'll see what final comments and questions come in. And if once we exhaust those, I think we'll move on to concluding. So let's push pause for, again, go on mute for another moment, possibly 2, and then we'll see what we get. Thank you. Just confirming we're still here. I'm going to wait another 30 seconds. It's always hard to know if dozens of you are feverishly typing or not. So just going to stand by for another 30 seconds. All right, so I'm going to read off the last couple comments that we have and any last stragglers, and then we'll move on to our last couple slides here. A couple of thoughts, I believe, again, from Mark. One idea would be to automatically offer to push data back to agencies who report perhaps a geospatial geographical report. For example, your system compared to all systems in your state, or based on size or population or vehicle fleet. Would be very helpful in providing context back. That's very useful feedback. Thank you, Mark. And think compactly seeing how that is his agency, any agency, stacks up to similarly sized agencies is very desirable. Great. Thanks again for that input. So we wanted to remind everyone on the fact that you can provide additional feedback to us today, even if we didn't have time to attend to your comment. So maybe you have a very long comment or question that you don't get to submit by the time we conclude. We do want to make you aware of the NTD feedback@fta.gov email address, and that'll be available at least envisioned for a week plus following this webinar. But I think due to the fact that we have another one of these for a different audience coming up in November, I think it'll be available at least through mid to late November. And Tom can confirm once we turn it back to him at the end. Do have 2 concluding polls, and then I'll turn it back to Tom to conclude for us. So let me pull up this poll. Okay. So reflecting back on the webinar, we're first wondering, what was your level of understanding of NTD data before today's feedback session? So again, before you came on to join us today, what was your level of understanding? Give you 10 more seconds there. And thanks for that. I'm sure some of you can imagine what's coming is a similar question, but now having participated in today's listening session, what's your level of understanding of NTD data? Hopefully we got a few of you to bump up a level, but feel free to be honest. Give you 10 more seconds here. And I'll go ahead and close that out. Thanks again to you all for your participation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to go over our last couple of slides.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. And I think, this was a smaller group than the full reporters because there were fewer of you, but it was really informative. I was just taking some notes of things that I've seen in the chat box and wanted to do some shout outs before we end. And I'll try to give you back a few more minutes of your time. We'll probably end before 3:30. A couple things, peer benchmarking and anything around kind of groups or clusters of comparable agencies or operators. It seems like any data products should at least try to gear towards those. I know I showed in the data tables where there's ranking around VOMs, that's sort of possible, but maybe in the future looking at potentially doing some sort of additional with other data products enabling of sort of benchmarking or peer comparisons. Monthly, I was very surprised to hear there would be some usefulness in data validation if we did collect monthly or even weekly data from you, but also that there's obviously burdens and resource constraints. So thank you for all that input. In addition, someone mentioned like consolidated forms. We've heard that elsewhere too, that I think tracing where in the forms the data points come from, like which form ends up in which place on our data products, is something that could be useful. In addition to maybe just having an open template to allow a combined, as much as possible, combined, I guess, data submission to us. And then, yeah, I think really interesting hearing some ideas about AVL data and geospatial and kind of the future, and where some of you even already have AVL feeds for your buses, which is really interesting. So we're looking at all that. We really appreciate your feedback. Hopefully you learned a lot. A number of you didn't know or didn't use our data products. Hopefully you will in the future, and we'll try to make sure they're geared towards your needs. Lori, or I guess should I just do the final remarks, or are you gonna?
I just wanted to pop back in and just say that everyone to please check your email. You should be receiving an evaluation survey about today, and we would appreciate if you would just take a couple minutes and fill that out for us. And other than that, thank you for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.